Good evening, Prince William County families. Welcome to tonight's family engagement series on paying for college early planning. Tonight's session will be presented in the requested languages of English and Spanish and will be recorded. On your computer, you're going to look for the interpretation button on your control bar. Once you pick your desired language, then your icon should change. On your phone, you will click Join Audio and click Call over Internet. Click on the three dots and More. Click on Language Interpretation and click on the language you want and done. Our Spanish interpreter will now read the directions.
Buenas noches y bienvenidos. Para español en su computadora, busque el globo en la parte inferior, haga clic para activar y escoja español. El icono cambia a ES, que es español, y haga clic para listo. En su teléfono, haga clic para unirse al audio a través del internet. Haga clic en los tres puntitos, haga clic en interpretación, escoja español y haga clic para listo. Gracias.
Interpretation will begin now. Tonight, we would like to welcome Jason Purrier. He's the director of the College Place. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Heather. And for the basis for this recording, I'll be using a presentation I use often, but I'll be spending a little bit of time in different areas than I normally do. Just because as there's a different focus to have in this conversation when I'm meeting with rising juniors and rising seniors than those who are earlier in the process and thinking ahead as well. The agenda overall from our presentation, though, stays the same. I talk about the financial aid applications that you may see as you work through this process of navigating the college admissions process and working through the financial aid process. I'll spend a little bit more time talking about scholarships and what students can do at any age, especially once they're in high school, to start identifying those resources that can be used to help pay for the education beyond high school. And I'll also spend a little bit more time than I usually do on the family discussion side of things, planning that students and parents can do now to have maybe even some hard conversations now so that the student can level set going into this process and figuring out what is the most affordable for them and the family in terms of their education. So in Virginia, generally, these are the 4 different types of applications you'll see in the financial aid process. Some colleges, universities may only ask for the free application for federal student aid, with the FAFSA, or the Virginia Alternative State Aid Application, or the VASA. Not every Virginian should fill out both. I'll talk about who should fill out which form in a moment. But some colleges may start and stop their financial aid process with that form. The good thing with that is that once you get through either one of these forms in Virginia, a lot of scholarship organizations will ask you for what's called your student aid index or your SAI. You cannot get that number without filling out these financial aid forms. As you're going through the process of exploring colleges, universities, finding what institution might be the right fit, look into what they ask for the financial aid process. One, because sometimes families will get really discouraged when they're looking ahead with net price calculators because it might not seem like you're going to get a lot of need-based financial aid from federal or state resources. I encourage you not to get too discouraged for that process. That happens a lot, especially if we're talking about Northern Virginia region, 2-parent household where both parents are working. It is not common in those scenarios to have students receiving need-based financial aid. But what colleges will talk to you about is how they review for merit scholarships. And if they don't mention a lot about it, that's an opportunity for you to step in and ask questions, especially if you're exploring colleges after 8th or 9th grade, really early in the process. Ask them about what their merit scholarship review process looks like and what you can do to put yourself in the best position to be eligible for those awards. And merit scholarships cover a wide range of things. It's Some of it can be driven by academics, but usually if it's an academic process, it's not driven just by GPA. Sometimes it'll be driven by the major the student is looking to enroll in, or the college is hoping to get more students to enroll into. Sometimes it's driven by the talent of the student, whether that's athletic, artistic, from a musical standpoint, what have you. If you haven't applied for financial aid at the college, sometimes those merit opportunities will not be made available to the student, even if they otherwise are eligible or should be receiving those merit awards. So as you're going through this process, make sure you're checking in with colleges. Most of them, I'd say it's close to 100% of the institutions in Virginia will tell you you have to apply for financial aid before being considered for merit scholarships. So even if you don't think you'll get anything out of the process of filling out your FAFSA or your VESA in terms of state or federal aid, please complete the process of applying for financial aid to make sure your student is going to get all the merit scholarships that they're eligible for in this process as well. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, some colleges may start and stop the process at the FAFSA or the VESA. Other colleges may ask you for one of those two forms and the CSS profile. And then last but not least in this process, there are scholarship applications that may be a part of the financial aid process at a college, depending on what college or university we're talking about. But these applications also exist outside of the college financial aid process. So usually actually around this time of the year, I'll get an email or a phone call. It's usually from a mom concerned because let's say their son decided on May 1st, which is typically decision day for colleges to pull in all the students who are accepted to go to them in the fall. And mom's really concerned because now there's a $10,000 gap and they're not sure what to do. This time, senior year, it's a really hard time to find something outside of essentially borrowing more from student loans. So students, wherever you're at in this process of finding what comes next after high school, you need to be applying for scholarships outside of the process of applying for admissions and financial aid at whatever college, universities on your list. Parents, this is where we can help our children, encourage them to apply for scholarships outside of the admissions and financial aid process. The more work they do on that end, the easier it'll be for them to afford their education, the less they'll have to ask you to support them financially. The more institutions and programs could be an opportunity for them because they have outside scholarships to help them pay for those educational expenses. In terms of the financial aid process overall, only the student status matters in the process of applying for financial aid. So as long as the student falls into one of the categories on this screen, so U.S. citizen, U.S. national, has a green card, granted asylum, or is a refugee, et cetera, and so forth, that student can fill out the FAFSA, and they're eligible to be considered for, at that point, once that form is submitted, federal, state, and institutional aid. If the parent has one of these statuses, it doesn't matter. If the parent is out of status, doesn't matter. Only the student status matters in this process. And as long as the student falls into one of these categories, they'll be filling out the FAFSA to apply for financial aid. That's where their financial aid process will start for most colleges and universities. Legally, the FAFSA is now required to open on October 1st. This fall will be the first year since that legislation was passed through Congress and signed by the president that will hit this deadline. So we haven't seen it yet. The last few years have been interesting in terms of the financial aid process. But when the form launches this fall, you'll see the 25-26 FAFSA shift down here where 24-25 is. And the 26-27 FAFSA form will be what's available here. That's going to be the case every year that you're talking about applying for financial aid. Whatever year your child is graduating from high school, you want to make sure you're applying for that next year, the next academic year in the financial aid process. And this is an every year thing. It's not a one-time thing. So as you're working through this process, make sure that you and your child, if you're a parent tuning in, are aware that this is a process you have to work through every year. The student is going into college after high school. Every contributor will need to create their own federal student aid or FSA ID. and work through their individual portion of the form. For students who are in the household with both biological or adopted parents who are married filing a joint tax return, pretty straightforward process. The student and one contributor parent will be identified as contributors to the form. If parents are married filing separately, you'll each be invited in as contributors. And then if parents are separated or divorced, that will, right now, the student will be directed to answer a question one way, and then the parent will add in more details. And so what I mean by that, separated is not an option that students right now are seeing on their portion of the FAFSA. So for parents who are separated but not yet divorced, when the student logs in, they'll fill out the form, but then the parent contributor, when they add in their portion, will identify that the separation and or divorce has happened. And then they'll pull out the information individually. But for parents who went through this process when you went to college on your own, or you may have older children who have gone to college, it used to matter about who the student lived with. That's not the case anymore. For both the FAFSA and the VESA, so the federal and state form, it's about who's providing the most financial support in the 12 months prior to the time the form is being filled out. Usually the last 2 years, it's still been the parent that the student is living with. But that's not always the case, especially in scenarios where parents are splitting costs literally 50-50 for the care of the child. In that scenario, the student is directed to make a decision between the parents. So it doesn't matter what was decided through the court, what custody agreements have in place. The student is directed to put down who they believe has contributed that additional 1 cent of support in that scenario. If you have questions about that, please ask as you work through this process. It's not a big deal, but it can make a significant impact in terms of what students receive in the financial aid process. But once you complete the form, it takes 1 to 3 business days for the FAFSA to be processed. The student aid index is visible to the student right now if they're the last contributor that's logged in. If a parent contributor is the last one logged in, you won't see the student aid index. You'll just see that the form has been submitted. And then college universities follow up a lot later in this process. This is going to be the case, especially if you're applying in the fall. So say the FAFSA launches October 1st of your child's senior year, and you complete the form, get everything submitted October 5th. You're not going to hear anything back from college universities until the spring. So that's 4 to 5 months after you submit the form. So I want to share that to say that there's no rush, that you don't have to submit the FAFSA or the VESA in October of the senior year of high school. If you're able to submit it that early, that's great. But as long as you're applying before the institution's priority deadline, which they'll have in addition to their deadlines for admission, that's really the only deadline you need to stay ahead of in the process of applying for financial aid. Like I mentioned, every contributor will need an FSA ID. If you have a Social Security number, as long as your Social Security card does not have a work authorization only stamped on it, you'll use that Social Security number to create your FSA ID. The only exceptions to that is if you or the student were admitted as a conditional admission or refugee, or you were admitted with asylum pending. Usually you'll get a Social Security card pretty early in the process. But if you haven't updated your Social Security card since asylum or a refugee status was granted, you may still have that Social Security card that says for work authorization only. In those scenarios, you would use your Social Security number to create an FSA ID at that point. If you have any questions about that, please ask as you work through that process. Generally, anybody here that has overstayed a visa or is out of status, you won't have a Social Security number. You may have an I-10. You don't use the individual taxpayer identification number at this point. You'll say you have no Social Security number and move forward through that process. The important thing about the FSA ID is that you use this information every year to log in and work through the process of completing this form. So you'll need to keep track of this information as a student goes through every year of college. As of right now, this is what federal grants look like in the financial aid process. There is pending legislation in front of Congress, at least from what we've seen from the House of Representatives, that has made proposals for some changes to some of these opportunities. Right now, federal Pell Grant, there has been no talk of changing the grant itself. The award amount or allocation, that's kind of still up in the air as Congress is working through. But the real reason I mentioned that is that there is at least initial talk for the Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant to be phased out in future years of financial aid. And I just mentioned that one just to encourage students and families to tune in to what's happening at the congressional level, so the federal level, but also at the General Assembly level in Virginia, because what legislators decide one year over another does have an impact in what's available in financial aid. And if you're early in the process of planning and you don't tune in again until senior year, sometimes that gap, in that gap, you may miss something. So this is my nudge to stay tuned in every year that your student is moving through high school, and just pay attention to what's being proposed or suggested. From what we've heard so far, it doesn't sound like the Senate is coming from the same perspective. So this may just be something that is kind of left on the wayside, and you may see nothing different in terms of what's available here as you work through the financial aid process. But I just mentioned that because it is a topic of conversation for Congress right now. And I just want you to be aware, especially if you have an 8th or a 9th grader and you're really planning far in advance, that some of what's made available to students may change in the next few years. So just tune in and make sure you're keeping abreast of those changes. The Teach Grant's available for anyone that wants to become an educator. So that's not tied to the student aid index in like the federal Pell Grant or the FSEOG fund is. So the student works with the college they enroll in to get access to these funds. There is a service requirement on the back end. As long as the student completes it, they're good to go. But if they don't, that becomes an unsubsidized loan with interest from the day the grant was initially dispersed to the student. As long as you teach for 4 years, either at a school of need or an area of need after graduation, within 8 years of graduation, the student is fine. If there's any hesitation for a student, if they think education might be a pathway, but they're not sure, that's the type of student that I would advise not to take advantage of these funds unless they're absolutely sure they can teach for the required number of years after graduation. And then last but certainly not least is the Iraq and Afghanistan Service Grant. That's for a student who lost a parent or guardian in active duty service to our country following the events of 9/11. So your student aid index has no bearing in this conversation. It focuses on that parent's sacrifice, and there's a waiver and some additional support up to right now what is available through the Pell Grant and other federal resources that will be made available to the student to help them pay for their college education. The Department of Defense confirms the relevant data there. And once the student submits their FAFSA, that information is released to them to help them pay for their education. But for all college universities, you'll have to submit the FAFSA or the VESA to get that student aid index to share out in this process. This is usually where I lose a lot of families in Northern Virginia, so hang in there with me through this part of the process. This is for the federal Pell Grant only. The eligibility for these funds, I know especially if both parents are in the household working, usually you're above this range. So I share that to say, one, don't get discouraged. Still work through the process of filling out the forms that financial aid is asking for. But for a single parent household, for the adjusted gross income, you have to fall below these numbers based on family size for the student to qualify for maximum Pell. If your household income is somewhere between these two numbers based on family size, the student will get what's called partial Pell. And then anything above this, it means they're not eligible for Pell. But again, that does not mean the student is ineligible to receive any need-based financial aid, or that they won't receive any need-based state aid, or that they won't receive any institutional aid. Here are similar numbers for two-parent households. These numbers do update. They're indexed to update each year, but they won't change drastically by tens of thousands of dollars. Say if you have a parent if you're a parent of somebody just finishing their freshman year, it's not going to change drastically by tens of thousands of dollars by the time you get to the senior year with your student. Same concept, just with a two-parent household at that point. Again, anything below this for adjusted gross income is max Pell. Anything between these is partial Pell. Anything above, not eligible for Pell. Again, this is just for the Pell Grant, not for every source of aid that's available. In Virginia, these are the grants that are most available, not most available, I'm sorry, they come up most often in the process of working through the financial aid process. And I say that one because for the federal process, there are federal grants beyond what I shared on the previous screen, but numerically it doesn't equal out to what's available at the state level. There are some grants that are tied to specific institutions based on major in Virginia that may be tied to financial need, but may be more tied to filling a need to build in and fill those academic programs. So just because you don't see something that fits on the screen from the state level does not mean there are not state grants that are available to students and families in Virginia. But as you go through the process and you go on college tours, make sure you're asking about that because sometimes even if to make sure you're understanding what specific major, not necessarily just the school that's required for the student to be enrolled in for them to be eligible for those grants where it's tied to a major more than financial need. Commonwealth Award is based on student aid index only, and it's only available at Virginia public colleges, goes up to tuition and fees. Commonwealth Award is based on student aid index and GPA, both at graduation from high school and then every year that the students enroll in college. It goes up to tuition and fees, but because these two awards cover essentially the same thing as a part of the cost of attendance, so tuition and fees, a student will only ever see one of these awards on a semester by semester basis in terms of financial aid. Virginia Tag is for any Virginian going to a Virginia private college. So student aid index does not play a role in this. Right now, VTAG is $5,000 a year. Once the student chooses to enroll in a private institution, they'll work with an institution to make sure they're filling out the correct form each year to get access to those funds. You do have to be full-time enrolled to get access to that. So as you're working through this process and you're researching about what grants are made available, you need to pay attention not just if it's based on student aid index, enrollment status, so full-time, part-time, public or private, sometimes it's major. There's a lot of stuff to keep track of in this process. The great thing about getting started early is that you've got a lot of runway in front of you. And even if I'm talking to a family that's finishing up junior year right now, you're still early enough in the process that you can make some plans based on the funding that's out there. But this is another opportunity where I advise students and families to tune in to what the General Assembly is proposing. Like I mentioned in the last session, they talked about zeroing out the Military Survivors Independence Education Program. When they made that decision, veterans and their supporters advocated for a different outcome. And the General Assembly in their special session decided to keep funding this program. There's a full tuition waiver and living stipend that comes from this. And so it's not based on student aid index, but it's also not based on the FAFSA or the VESA. There's a separate application through the Department of Veteran Services that the student will initiate and their parent will help them complete to get access to this. This is for a student who lost a parent or guardian in active duty service, but also because we have a large veteran population in Virginia. If the veteran has a 90% or greater disability rating, service-connected disability, their spouse and their dependent children up to the age of 27 are eligible for funding through this program to pay for their education. I mentioned the VESA earlier. This is not for every Virginian to fill out in the process of applying for financial aid. It is an alternative form for students who are ineligible to receive federal aid. And I know on the screen it says that ineligible to file a FAFSA. Technically, an undocumented student could use a FAFSA or could be directed to use a FAFSA to apply for financial aid for colleges in DC or Maryland or Pennsylvania. But a student that's out of status would not be eligible to receive any federal aid. So for a student in that scenario, the VESA application is available for them to apply for state aid. So the state grants that I mentioned on the previous screen, it'll generate a student aid index that scholarship organizations can use in determining eligibility for their scholarship awards. But no federal aid is awarded, and it's not guaranteed that institutional aid is awarded. So if you're asking me which form is better in terms of access to money, the FAFSA gives you the most access in terms of available pots of money to draw from in this process. The VESA is more limited, but again, only the student status matters. So the student is eligible to receive federal aid. You fill out the FAFSA, you don't think about the VESA. If the student is here out of status, you fill out the VESA for any Virginia college or university that you're applying to. But on the same note, you may be asked to fill out the FAFSA for schools that are outside of the Commonwealth. It depends on the college or university that we're talking about out of state. You do need 2 years of Virginia state tax return information to be eligible. Those tax returns don't need to be filed. So in scenarios where parents are not making enough to hit the filing threshold, you just have to have the data to be reported in at that point. And then again, legal status of parents is not a factor in determining eligibility for the VESA. Same as for the FAFSA. If the student is not sure which form to fill out, on SHEV's website, which houses the VESA application, there's a helpful guide to work through. And that'll direct you as far as which form you should fill out at that point. I'll spend a little more time talking about the CSS profile than I normally do, because not only do colleges, universities, you may find in this process, will they be asking for this form, but some scholarship programs will ask for the CSS profile as well. In the last few years, when there has been a struggle to get the FAFSA launched on time, some college universities were asking for an abbreviated version of the profile to give students an estimated financial aid outlook in this process. So I imagine as things move forward, some colleges may keep that. That abbreviated profile is not the same as the full CSS profile. And I'll share in a moment what college universities in Virginia are asking for this full profile. But I mentioned the profile more because this is where non-custodial parent information can become an inhibiting factor in the process. So say parents are divorced and student has been living with mom for the last 15 years, and there's been absolutely no contact with dad in those 15 years. You'll fill out a request to not submit that non-custodial parent information. So it's a waiver for that information. But college universities that are asking for the profile, they're in the position individually to say yes or no. So just because you submit a waiver to not have to turn in this non-custodial parent information does not mean that that waiver will be approved. In scenarios where there just there isn't normal contact, that's not enough to get a waiver approved. In situations where there was abuse or fear for the safety or well-being of the student, those are scenarios that are almost universally granted in terms of having a waiver accepted. But in scenarios where a waiver is not granted or available, non-custodial parent information can be harder to get, especially where there hasn't been a lot of contact with a non-custodial parent. So if this scenario rings true to you, for the parent, if you are able to have a cordial conversation with your co-parent, then I would encourage you to do that. If it is a situation where your child is better able to speak to that parent, I'd encourage them to just give them a heads up now that some of the colleges they may be applying to may be asking for this information in a few years. But this form digs a lot deeper into income and assets than what you'll see on the FAFSA or the VESA. So if it takes the family an hour to work through the FAFSA, I'd plan for 2 hours, maybe a little bit more, to work through the profile. It's just ask for a lot more information than what the FAFSA or the VESA do. As of the 25-26 academic year, these are the college universities in Virginia that ask for the CSS profile. So again, it's not all of them by any stretch of the imagination. Holland University is an institution that I know is asking for this that wasn't in 24-25. So as you work through each year of high school, you may see some schools get added onto this list and other schools may drop off. Typically, this form is only asked for the first year that the student is entering into the institution. So it's not something that you'd fill out every year, unlike the FAFSA or the VESA, which are forms that you need to fill out every year the student is working through their college education. In terms of federal student loans, I've highlighted two things here that I'll touch on in a moment. But as of right now, direct subsidized loans, those are need-based, so based on the student aid index. Interest is paid by the U.S. Department of Education while the student is in college. The reason I have an asterisk here is because right now there's a proposal that's being talked about in Congress to eliminate subsidized loans as an opportunity to pay for education. Same thing, from what we're hearing from the Senate, it doesn't sound like the two houses are on the same page. But I share that to say that is a proposal right now. Financial aid is essentially forward funded in this process for the most part. So I'm almost 100% certain that for any rising senior, so someone completing the end of the junior year, everything that I mentioned is going to be available exactly as I've described it in this presentation. More than a year out from graduation, so say 2 years or 3 years out, I'm not sure. Unsubsidized loans are still being talked about as being made available. So those are non-need based. The limits in terms of what's available through unsubsidized loans may change, especially if subsidized loans are phased out as an opportunity. And then they're also talking about potentially eliminating Parent Plus loans and really all other plus loan programs. But I mentioned that because some families have used this primarily as kind of the last stopgap to fill to cover the cost of attendance. But if it's not available, you need to look for other opportunities now to cover what gap is there. Parent Plus loans do require a credit check. It is a hard check, hard draw. And then the parent has to be a biological or adopted parent to get access to a Parent Plus loan. Unlike subsidized and unsubsidized loans, which if the student is enrolled at least part-time making progress towards a degree, they have until 6 months after completion to start working on repayment. For Parent Plus loans, repayment starts 30 to 45 days after that loan is dispersed. So if you're using a Parent Plus loan to pay for your child's education, that loan is taken out in your name as a parent on behalf of your student, and then you're responsible for almost immediately beginning repayment once that loan is taken out. And I say this all the time to students and parents alike. Parents, we will do almost anything for our kids, especially when it comes to the point of if they get into their dream school, into their dream major. Sometimes financial aid changes it from a dream opportunity into a little bit of a nightmare. So this is where I always encourage students and families to have conversations. Talk to your parents, parents, talk to your kids about what is realistic and affordable financially. Parents know sometimes we will do more than maybe what we should financially to help our kids out. We do it from a place of love, but to keep in mind that can hurt financially. Because sometimes I've talked to parents that have been paying Parent Plus loans for 30 years. If you're using that as a primary way to pay for your kids' education or for multiple kids' education, it is a heavy commitment in terms of finances, and it could be a long time in terms of what it takes to pay that off. So just be honest about what is available and what's realistic. And the earlier you have that conversation, the more you reinforce it, the more motivation parents that you can put under your kids' butts to apply for scholarships. Because really, the more they do in terms of applying for scholarships, the less loans have to be an option, whether it's federal loans, a Parent Plus loan, private loans. I want that to be the last option that's pursued to pay for education, not the first option that's chosen out of ease of access to funding to pay for post-secondary ed. And why do I say that? One, because there's a lot of money out there that's available for scholarships. There's 7.1 billion. Actually, I need to update this slide in particular because the last time we did an assessment on this, the number is projected to be over 8 billion in future years. Needless to say, there's a lot of money out there. to help students pay for education, whether they're pursuing a career technical education, an associate's degree, a four-year degree, if they have plans to go to medical school or law school, 4, 5, 8 years down the road from now. Over 100 million goes unawarded because students don't apply. There are scholarships that somebody that's just finishing 9th grade can put themselves in the running for and be awarded at the end of this year that they can use 3 years from now to help them pay for their education entering into their freshman year. So it's never too early to start looking. I always encourage students, no matter what grade you're in, pay attention when senior announcements are being made or when they're talking about senior assemblies or graduation ceremonies, and that you may hear over the intercom, so-and-so got this scholarship, this $500, this $1,000 scholarship. I pay attention to those announcements. One, because those are usually local scholarships. Those are scholarships that you have the best opportunity to get from a statistical standpoint, because usually they're either for your county or for your school, or they may be from a family that's looking to send somebody from your high school to a college that they went to directly. But there's no upper limit. So there's no end goal in terms of applying for scholarships. If you start at the end of your freshman year, you'll need to keep track and stay organized in this process. Parents, this is where we can help our children out. If you have to wake up your kid to make sure they either get on the bus or that they're ready for you to drop them off at school, they need your help in this process. Not to say that they can't do it, but if you're doing those little things structurally to get them started in their day, to help them work through their day overall, they need your support to stay organized in this process. 3 years is a long time to keep up with information about a $500 scholarship to follow up on when you get to senior year. And everything that's going to be coming your students' way between the college admissions process, working through scholarship senior year, wanting to do, prom and homecoming and spend time with their friends and all the other activities that students will get into through high school, sports and the arts. There's going to be so much coming at them. This is one way that you can help them stay organized and involved in this process. This is a place where I always encourage students to invite your parents in, show them the work that you're doing to find scholarships. One, because you can give them a little bit of peace of mind that you're not just thinking that you're going to rely on them to help you pay for your education. But two, if you're in a position where you're going to need your family to help you out with the last couple of $1,000s for your cost of education, I think of a mom or dad being much more willing to help you if you show them that you put in the work to apply for scholarships. And maybe it just hasn't worked out exactly like you wanted it to, but you're at least showing them that you're doing the work in this process of applying. So let's start local. Start with your school counselor. When they send out emails, please read them. Parents, if you get to the end of junior year and you're worried because you haven't heard anything, that's not because the school has not sent you information. Usually that means your son or daughter has not opened an email. They haven't looked at their text messages. They haven't responded to requests that's come out from the college career counselor. No matter which high school you're talking about in Prince William County, I've worked with all the college career counselors, and I know that every single one of them sends out information through text, through email. We just know that students don't read their emails. So parents, if you can help just getting your kids to look at their emails, that'll be doing everybody a huge service in this process. One, because you'll see what scholarships are being made available to students at your high school or that are made available based on the major that maybe your son or daughter wants to pursue in college. But also think about parents where you work. Maybe you haven't thought about educational benefits because you haven't been in school for 20, 30, 40 years. That does not mean that your employer doesn't have educational benefits that you can tap into to help your child pay for college. You might just not have thought about it. So check there to see what's available, to see if there are scholarships that are available there. Think local. So if you practice a particular faith, maybe your place of worship gives out a scholarship to all graduating students based on X, Y, and Z. So make sure your student is doing X, Y, and Z to get that scholarship. Think about regional associations that your faith may belong to. Think about regional associations that a sport or another extracurricular activity may belong to, because there may be scholarship opportunities there based on participation in a certain type of activity, or qualifying for regional, state, national level competition. But I mentioned that one because there's a lot out there. And if you start early on in high school, thinking about what your student is involved in and looking to see what scholarships may be attached to those opportunities by the time you get to senior year, that's a manageable process. It's something you can do year by year, keep track of, organize, make sure you're paying attention to what scholarships are there. One, because there are some deadlines that'll pop up really early senior year, and the more work you've done organizing yourself prior to getting to that point, the easier it'll be to work through the scholarship process, which is separate from the college admissions process, which is separate usually from the financial aid process as well. So a lot of things to keep track of. Don't wait to research. Look now. Even if an award is only available for a junior or senior to apply for, if you're working with a sophomore and planning ahead, that scholarship needs to be on their list to apply for this time, or maybe a little bit earlier, but 9 to 10 months from now, junior year. These are different websites that we recommend using. These are not the only websites that are available in terms of where to find resources to apply for scholarships. I will say that the more you use them, the easier this process will be to navigate. But also in terms of scholarships, the more specific you can be for the student as you're building your profiles on these sites, the better. And the example that I always use is when I'm talking to an audience in person, I'll ask everybody to raise their hands if they're left-handed. Or I'll also ask if there are any natural redheads in the audience, because there are scholarships available for natural redheads and left-handed people. So it's that specific. So students, think about every way that you walk through this world and exist in it. There are characteristics that you want to put into these profiles to give an accurate reflection of you. When I'm meeting, especially with seniors who are really discouraged and they've used these search engines to try to find scholarships to apply for, through conversation, what usually comes out is that they weren't specific enough in building their profile on the front end. So the results that they're getting on the back end don't apply to them, or they don't feel like it applies to them. So it's always worth your time to do more data entry on the front end to make sure that the results that you're getting on the back end really fit you in this process. I would log in at least once a month to all these sites, whichever sites you use in this process, because a lot of them will have scholarships that'll go up beginning of the month. They'll do a drawing by the end of the month, and then they will throw up the same prompt the next month and do another drawing at the end of that month. So the more you make this a regular part of your process, for anybody in high school, if you're starting freshman year, say you use all these sites and you build profiles on all these sites, you don't have to spend hours a week freshman year looking for scholarships. If you set aside 30 minutes once a month to look for scholarships during your freshman year, that's plenty of time. You don't have to overwhelm yourself. But the less you do freshman, sophomore, junior year, the more work you'll have to do senior year if you're serious about finding outside scholarships to help you pay for college. So make it a habit early on. That way, by the time you get to senior year, it's something that students are used to. They've already built into their schedule. It's something that's not going to feel like a stretch because it's something they're used to, having worked through this process all along. And then last but not least, have discussions early and often about money in this process. If I'm talking to a student and family at the beginning of freshman year, maybe even at the end of 7th or 8th grade, there's an opportunity to talk about a 529 plan. Or in West Virginia, anything that gives you the opportunity to put money away. Sometimes it's after taxes, sometimes it's pre-tax income based on the plan that you're talking about. But give yourself the opportunity to allow compounding interest to help you pay for your education at that point. But also, this is an opportunity, maybe parents, you're not in a position to set aside money. This is one of those scenarios when I'm talking to parents. Sometimes, like I mentioned earlier, we're trying to help our kids out and we do more than we can. This is an opportunity to give a nudge to your student. Why aren't they saving money to help pay for their education? Because at the end of the day, the college education is the responsibility of the students to pay for, not your responsibility as a parent. If you're able to help them out, it's great. If your kid never tells you thank you, I'm telling you thank you on their behalf because they should be. but sometimes we forget as kids to tell our parents that out loud, even though we think it. But talk about where you can save money in this process. And sometimes saving money means going to community college first, and still living at home, and then transferring out to complete your degree at a 4-year school after that. Sometimes it means going into a 4-year school first, but maybe from a place where you can commute from home versus moving onto campus. The earlier you have these conversations as parents, the earlier you have conversations with students in terms of what your goals are, the better. Because sometimes parents have different ideas about what we want our kids to do than what our kids have themselves. So talk about this. What is reasonable that somebody can earn or save between now, by the time we get to this point, senior year of high school? Because some numbers are realistic and some are not. Some families are in a situation where by the time they get to senior year, maybe $10,000 can be set aside to help the student pay for college. If you're talking 9th grade, $2,500 a year, maybe that's a goal that a student can help work towards through a part-time job, but it should be a family discussion and a family goal at that point. What is reasonable? If you set a $5,000 goal each year, but you're only able to contribute $1,000 or $500 or $20, you're making progress towards that goal. But I mentioned that one, just to make sure you're making the goal realistic. One, to level set early on for the student, what is really feasible from a financial standpoint for the household, and what's just unrealistic. It can help level set for our children. You know, maybe they're asking for too much, or maybe they're not asking for enough from themselves before asking for something from us as their parents. Housing costs different things depending on what amenities the student wants. So if your kid has their own room right now, if you're looking to save money, they need to have a roommate or two in college. So they got to get that, you got to get that idea out of their head now that they're going to have their own room in college, unless they want to pay for it or find scholarship in enough quantities to help pay for that. Food may be an area to save money. For me, when I was a teenager, that was not a place I could save money. I ate a lot. I ate often, 4 to 5 meals a day. My metabolism was through the roof. I eat probably 3 times as much as I do now as an older adult. But you know your kid. We need to make sure our children eat well enough to sleep well enough to keep up with their classes. So for students who need, like me, a really robust meal plan, that's not a place that you can save money. On the other hand, if your kid eats 2 meals a day, maybe, and they're fine, you don't need a meal plan that gives them access to their dining hall 3 times a day, every day, Saturday through Sunday. In terms of books and supplies, maybe the student can rent textbooks versus purchasing them, both digital and hard copies. Just keep in mind that if you like to make notes in the margin, you're going to be paying for those books at the end of the semester. So I would not rent books if you like drawing or doodling or highlighting to keep up with academics. What bills and entertainment are part of the package? Maybe there's a Netflix subscription that the student is going to be using from mom or dad. Maybe they want their own account. They want their own account. That's something they'll have to pay for at that point. Have that conversation now. Does the family have health insurance? Can the parents afford to keep the son or daughter on health insurance as they go into college? Have that conversation. Transportation costs. If you're commuting to and from campus, how are you going to get there? Is there a car, an additional car at the house that the student can use? If not, maybe the student gets a part-time job over the course of the next few years in high school to save up money to get a car to get them to and from college. Parents, I know sometimes we think, oh, we can make it work. We'll figure it out from a scheduling standpoint. But if there's 2 parents, 1 car, and a kid that's going to college, that's a really hard scenario to share all the same car to get everybody where they need to be on a day-by-day basis. But have those conversations now and start talking about what is responsible, what's reasonable for the family to commit to, but what also can the student do to figure things out along the way. And in terms of borrowing money, I say that for last because I really want this to be your last option. Whether we're talking about federal resources or private sources, you can borrow an almost endless amount of money to pay for a college education. There is a reasonable amount from my perspective. The number for me is different than it'll be for another person or another family. As a family, have that conversation about what is a reasonable amount of money to borrow for college. Some parents are driven by the very specifics of the degree. Like if a student is going to go in, get a 4-year degree, and the average income at graduation for that degree is $80,000, they'll say, that's it. That's your student loan limit. 80,000 is what you're going to earn at graduation. That's something reasonable that you can afford to pay back over the course of 10 years, 20 years working. When I was in your shoes as a teenager, for students that are tuning into this presentation, I could not comfortably borrow more than what my mom made to pay for my education. So for me, that was my own limit. I don't think I ever discussed that with my mom in terms of what I had decided for myself. But that number is different for everybody. So the earlier you talk about what a reasonable amount of money to borrow is, the better. One, because for teenagers, parents, all these numbers are imaginary numbers, whether it's borrowing 10,000, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, all these numbers are up in the sky above their heads. It's something they haven't dealt with. And parents, whether or not you went to college, this is where your life experience is invaluable to your children, because you have a car note or have had a car note, you have a mortgage, you have rent payments, you have revolving debt, you have borrowed money to pay for unexpected medical expenses in numbers that often exceed what a student is being asked to borrow in the process of paying for their education. So you are able to help inform your child about what is reasonable in this process, but also what are the burdens that come with borrowing money at this level? What are the sacrifices that you've had to make for them, maybe that they haven't realized as your child, but as parents, because you borrowed money to pay for X, Y, and Z, because that was the way that you could make it work financially. Have conversations now about that, and again, talk about what is a reasonable amount of money to borrow, because again, your son or daughter who have paperwork put in front of them to borrow $100,000, $150,000, and there's not a lot in terms of barriers to stop them in this process, especially from private sources when it comes to paying for an education. So please talk, set a reasonable limit ahead of time. It is possible to find enough scholarship dollars to not have to borrow anything to pay for a college education. And that's the situation that I want every student and family to be in by the time they get to this point senior year. I want the student to have all the private scholarships that are available to them and to not have any concern about how they're going to pay for education. And I want every parent to be in a scenario where they don't have to borrow any money or do any payment plans to help the kids pay for college. That's the ideal. Scholarships, free money takes care of it all. So the earlier you start this process, having these conversations, level set, the better. And then that's the formal end of my presentation. I will say that for anybody that has not signed up to receive information from the college place, you don't have to sign up to receive information, but for anybody that does, by June 1st, I'm doing a scholarship drawing for new signups. And literally the only thing you have to do when you sign up, when you get the text message that'll come out for me as an automated, like, hey, welcome, just respond. That's all you have to do. And I'll do the drawing by June 15th, and I'll be sending out information next month. And it doesn't matter if you're just finishing 9th grade for the student or for any parents who has a senior that's graduating. Maybe you're attending just to get some last minute information about things you can do. If you sign up your senior to receive information from me, I'll enter them into this contest as well. But my contact information is here. My name is Jason Pereira. Parents usually are more comfortable emailing me or calling me. Students are usually more comfortable sending a text message. Whichever way you want to reach out, I welcome all those reach out opportunities. So please don't hesitate to reach out if you have questions along the way. More than happy to support. And I didn't mention it earlier, but at any point in this process, if you need my assistance, it's free to you. I never charge any school, organization, or family that I work with for my support. It's entirely free. Thank you all.
Thank you for joining us tonight, Jason. We thank all the parents for joining us tonight. Resources that Jason shared from tonight's presentation will be shared with you in a follow-up email. I have put the link to join the email list and to register to win the scholarship in the chat. I have also placed in the chat a survey to let us know what programs you're interested in hearing information on. We hope everyone has a lovely evening, And I hope you can join us next time. Thank you, Dr. Shaver, for joining us also. Have a great evening, everyone.